Well, hello everybody. I want to welcome you to this presentation of Introduction to the SSIS Catalog. I appreciate you hanging out with me for the next 30 or 45 minutes or so. We're going to talk about an introduction to the SSIS Catalog. Um, SSIS Catalog is not necessarily new. It's been around since 2012 with SQL Server 2012. But in my travels in both consulting and training, I'm surprised at how few organizations have actually implemented the SSIS catalog. A lot of times when I talk about the integration services catalog, I'll ask who's using it, who's familiar with it, and there's a surprising number of organizations that are not really comfortable with it or haven't started using it at all. So I put together this brief webinar just to go over an introduction, what the benefits are, what possibly some of the risks are, and then I'll quickly drive through what interacting with the catalog looks like from a developer level as well as from someone invoking and monitoring the SSIS packages. Just a brief agenda. We'll talk about the catalog overview. What is it? Why would you want to use it? We'll talk about deployment, what the deployment story looks like, how to use what tools that you can use for deploying to the SSIS catalog. We'll talk about logging. Admittedly, logging is not one of those exciting topics, but it is a core foundation of any ETL system and specifically integration services. We'll talk about what security looks like in the SSIS catalog. And finally, I've got several demos that we'll go through that will show you how to interact with the catalog, like I mentioned a little bit earlier. For those of you who know me, this will be a review. For those who don't, an introduction. My name is Tim Mitchell. I'm a data architect and consultant. I'm based in the Dallas, Texas area, though I help clients from coast to coast. You can follow my blog at timmitchell.net. And if you're on Twitter, you can follow me at Tim_Mitchell on Twitter. A little about my company. The company that I own and run is Tylerus Data Solutions. We specialize in data warehousing, ETL, reporting, and things that touch those disciplines. We don't really specialize in any particular vertical, so we've helped clients from healthcare to manufacturing to advertising to just about every vertical, you name it. So if we can ever help you with anything, certainly reach out to us and we'd be glad to chat. So briefly, a catalog overview. Let's start with just a little bit of history. So those of you who have worked with integration services for a while might know a little bit about this, but in deploying to the SSIS server, rather deploying SSIS packages to SQL Server, in versions 2005 and 2008, the first two versions that were available with integration services, if you were deploying to SQL Server, you were effectively deploying to the MSDB database. There wasn't a dedicated area where you could deploy those. And that was true for DTS as well, for those of you who worked with data transformation services or DTS back before integration services. You could also deploy to the file system, which wasn't so much a deployment as much as just a copying over from your development directory into the production directory. But either way, those were the two methods that were available for deployment in older versions of SSIS. Now, you can still deploy SSIS packages even in 2012, 2014, 2016, and in the upcoming 2017 version. You can still deploy to MSDB, you can still deploy to the file system, but you don't really get any of the benefits of the catalog that I'll be telling you about a little later today. But those options are still available if you've got some investment in the older way of doing deployment. As I mentioned, the catalog was new in 2012. It was released with SQL Server 2012, and it became the centerpiece or the focal point for all your deployment, all your execution, all your monitoring, and all your logging. Previously, if you were deploying to the file system or to MSDB, it was really up to you as to how you did execution, where you would do logging, and how you would do logging. The catalog simplified that by allowing you to do everything in one central location. Took away a few of the configuration options for you, but at the same time, it makes it a lot more simple, and a lot of the things that used to be a lot of manual work are now mostly automated. One thing you have to pay attention to when you're moving from the deployment to the file system or to MSDB and going over to the SSIS catalog is that the deployment story is now that you deploy on a project by project basis. So previously, if you were loading, or rather if you were developing multiple SSIS packages, you deploy the packages one at a time. When you move over to the SSIS catalog, by default, you're deploying the entire project at one time. So if you've got 10 packages in your project, the default way to do deployment is to deploy the entire project rather than a package at a time. Admittedly, this posed some issues for some organizations because if you've got 10 or 20 or even 50 different packages in your project, changing one and needing to redeploy one means you're redeploying the entire project. So that required a little bit of a change of thinking in the way that you deployed and stored your SSIS packages. It doesn't necessarily represent a challenge if you're doing source control properly, but it is something that you do have to watch out for. One thing that I'll mention on the project level deployment is that if you're using 2016, and this only applies to 2016 and newer, you can deploy one package at a time to the SSIS catalog. So rather than having to deploy the entire project, you can do incremental package by package by package deployment with an asterisk. And I want you to keep this in mind because this is a risk. If your package has a project level connection or a project level parameter, if you deploy that package by itself, that project level asset is not deployed as part of that singleton deployment. Now, if you've deployed those separately, if you've previously deployed them and haven't modified them since the last deployment, it's not really a big deal. But if you create a new package, if along with that new package you create a new project level connection or a project level parameter and you deploy that one package by itself, it will let you deploy it. But the first time you try to execute it, it's going to blow up. So do be aware of that when you think about, do you want to deploy the entire project or a singleton package at a time? Again, that only applies if you're on 2016 or newer. If you're on 2012 or 2014, you don't have any other option other than deploying the entire project at one time. The catalog lives in a database called SSIS-DB. It's not created by default. You have to actually go through the exercise of creating it. Even if you install the SSIS components, the catalog will not be there. Good news is that creating that it's about a 15-second process. It's maybe 4 or 5 clicks that it takes to create that. That database is dedicated to the SSIS-DB assets. So previously, if you were doing deployment and logging in MSDB, that was all in the MSDB database, and it was a shared database. In the catalog has its own separate database, so everything related to the logic of the integration services package is stored in that SSIS-DB database. The only thing that you'll find in MSDB related to SSIS catalog is if you create a SQL Server agent job, for example. The job agent itself, or rather the job itself, is still stored in MSDB just like it always has been. But all of your packages, all of your configurations, all of your logging is now dedicated to the SSIS-DB database. And all that's located on just a single database. I mentioned this earlier that the granularity is project and not package. I think the reason Microsoft did that was they want you to look at the entire project as an application rather than package by package. But it is something that you have to be aware of, and you do have to ensure that you're using good source control practices. I'm always surprised at how many organizations are not using source control. So if you're not using it, let this be just another recommendation that you really need to be on some sort of source control. It doesn't matter necessarily what type of source control, whether you're on GitHub or TFS or some other source control. Source control, whatever it is for you, is critical, and especially when you go over to catalog deployment, where you're deploying the entire project and multiple packages at one time. So versioning is built into the SSIS catalog, and what that means is that if you deploy and redeploy the same project over and over again, it will retain a certain number of versions in the SSIS catalog. By default, that's set to 10 different versions per project. So if you deploy 11 different times, the 10th or the oldest one, or rather the 11th one, the oldest one that you had deployed, that one will roll off. And if you deploy again, the next oldest one will roll off, and so on. This is a great way so there's 2 real use cases for this. If you want to do regression testing, if you want to deploy and then realize, hey, this doesn't look like what I expected it to, or if you want to compare an older version to a newer version fairly quickly without redeploying, using versioning is a great way to do that. Second use case is, and we've all had these, that oops moment where I meant to deploy to dev, I accidentally deployed to prod, I need to quickly on the prod server go back to the old version of the code. You can do that through the versioning tool without having to go back through the exercise of redeploying your code. Simply go into the list of versions, say I want to use not the most current version that I deployed, but the one before that. And that will allow you to use that older version without having to redeploy your code. But make sure that you're not using this as a substitute for source control. The versioning tool in SSIS, or the versioning system in SSIS, is not source control. So make sure that in addition to the versioning, you also have some sort of external source control, because this versioning is definitely not intended for use as a source control tool. One of the things that you'll notice in the SSIS catalog is the way we do package configurations, or passing values into the packages at runtime, has changed. Previously, you would use a package configuration, a parent package configuration, an XML file configuration, and those are still available. You can still use those. However, the more catalog-ish approach is now to put all of your configuration variables into an environment. An environment is something that lives in the SSIS catalog, and I'll show you when we get to the demos where those live. But those are stored in the SSIS catalog. They're stored securely, so if you've got values like passwords or encryption keys, those can be marked as sensitive and stored securely and encrypted in the SSIS database. But what that allows you to do is to store all those configuration values in the SSIS catalog, and then specify at runtime, I'm going to use environment A or environment V or environment C, or whatever environment you want to use for that execution. It doesn't require an external XML file. It doesn't require a different SQL server. All of it is consolidated into the SSIS catalog. And you can use, just like you could with configurations, you can have one package that will use multiple different configurations, or one of several different configurations. You can also have one configuration that can be used by several different packages. So consider that to be sort of a one-to-many, or rather a many-to-many relationship. Logging. So if you were on an older version of SSIS, you probably struggled at some point with doing logging. In 2005 and 2008, if you wanted to configure logging on your SSIS packages, you were doing that on a piecemeal basis, on a package by package basis. While that was flexible, it was also cumbersome, because you had to go package by package. And if you wanted to make any sort of change across the board, I want to change the granularity of what I'm getting, I want to change the table to which I'm writing, or the database to which I'm writing, or the file format to which I'm writing, you had to touch every single SSIS package to change that. If there's one compelling feature above all else that makes it really a worthwhile investment to upgrade, logging is absolutely that feature, because logging allows you at runtime to define, I want no logging, I want basic logging, I want to get performance information, or I want verbose logging, and I want to get everything, including the kitchen sink, on my logs. And it doesn't require any sort of modifications to the package. You don't have to open the package whatsoever. That's a runtime setting. So if you set it for verbose for this execution, next time you execute it, unless you specify verbose again, it's going to go back to the default setting, which is basic, if you don't override that. It's almost completely automatic. I hate to say anything's completely automatic, but if you don't change anything at all on the SSIS catalog, don't change any settings, don't specify any logging level, it will automatically log every package execution in the SSIS catalog with basic logging, which will give you start and stop times. It'll give you task by task when every task started and stopped, as well as any error information, any error messages that pop out of that. So if you don't do anything at all, you're automatically getting at least a basic level of logging. All that logging takes place in the SSIS DB database. So again, that database becomes the centerpiece for all your executions. And within the SSIS DB database, there are a series of tables, and I'll call those out in just a second, that will be written to as part of that. And you can go query those tables. There's some built-in reports, but you can directly query those as well. Some of those logging tables, so I note they're logging views as well. Every view that you see here, there is an underlying table to support that. Typically, Microsoft will recommend that instead of using the tables, you use the views, because that's kind of a rolled up version. It's already got a few joins in there to join together some of the more common information that you would get in those reports. Here are the most 5 common ones you can get information about every execution. So every time you kick off a package, the tasks therein, the component phases, if you're using a higher level of logging, even on that 4th one down, if you get verbose logging mode, you can actually get native row counts in the SSIS catalog. It will log the number of rows that was passed through, not just at the data flow level, but from one leg to another. So if you have a source going to a lookup to a derived column transformation, and that one goes out to a destination or OLB destination, for example, the row counts for every leg along the way will be logged to the SSIS DB database. You could do this in older versions, but it was cumbersome because you had to build in row count transformations between every one of those and then explicitly and separately log that information. If you're using verbose logging mode, that happens automatically now. So be careful about using verbose logging mode. It does capture a lot of information, but that does give you native row counts without any extra work whatsoever on your part. Just one quick link. So if you want more information about those logging tables and views, I wrote a relatively long blog post a few months ago about those logging tables and views. You can go out. I won't go exhaustively through those on this presentation just for the interest of brevity, but you can go out and explore some of that. And I'll have the link as a separate download. I'll have the presentation as a download as well, so you'll have that link in there. So let's talk a little bit about deployment. So once you've in Visual Studio, once you've got your package developed, you need to get it over to the SSIS catalog. There's 3 different ways that you can do that. You can do it through SQL Server Management Studio. Directly from the UI, you can point to the compiled or the binary file that SSIS creates. That's called an ISPAC file or a .ispac file. That's automatically created in the background every time you build or every time you do a save or an execution in Visual Studio. You can also do it through T-SQL, and you'll find most anything, not just deployment, but most any action that you take in the catalog, you can do it in the UI. You can also do it in T-SQL as well. There's a stored procedure for just about everything in the SSIS catalog. And then finally, you can use Visual Studio as well. So if you want to invoke the deployment in Visual Studio, you can do it easily in Visual Studio as well. And finally, let's talk a little bit about security. So securing the SSIS catalog is much easier than it was in older versions, because if you were using an older version in 2005 or 2008, security was pretty broad. You really couldn't get that specific about who could view, who could execute, and so on. Now it's really specific because it looks sort of like a Windows access control list, and you can specify person by person or group by group what security needs to look like. And you can specify within a single project or a single folder, this group has access to edit or redeploy or delete. This other group has access to just read, and yet another group has access to execute. If you're in a small organization, that's probably not going to be critical, because if they have access, they're going to have complete access. If you work at a bigger company where there's a different development group from the monitoring group and a different monitoring group from the group who would actually execute the packages, this could be useful for you. So I'm going to jump over to SQL Server Management Studio. So the first thing you'll notice on a machine that has the SSIS catalog, so this is SQL Server Management Studio. I'm connected to my SQL Server 2016 machine. I do have the catalog set up here, and the one thing that you'll notice is to browse the SSIS assets, I'm not separately connecting to integration services. What I mean by that is previously, if I wanted to connect to MSDB and see the packages that were deployed to MSDB, I'd have to go through this process, click Connect, connect to integration services, and separately create a connection to integration services. I no longer have to do that when I'm using the SSIS catalog, because there's a new node appropriately called integration services catalogs that will let me browse all those assets that are deployed out to the SSIS catalog. Everything stored in here will be under the SSIS DB folder. The catalog, it can have any name you want it to have, as long as the name that you want it to have is SSIS DB. Also, one thing to note, curiously enough, integration services catalogs is plural in the UI. You can only have one catalog. I'm thinking that maybe they designed the UI for future growth where multiple catalogs could be in place. I can think of some cases where it might be useful to have multiple catalogs, but for right now, you can only have one, and it will always be called SSIS DB. So in this case, I've got a couple of folders that I've already created, and you can explicitly create folders in here. One thing to keep in mind is that you can see that in my integration services catalogs node, I've got 4 different folders out here. You can only create one level of folders. And what I mean by that is within SSIS DB, I created each one of these, but I can't go into this intro to the SSIS catalog folder. I can't create a subfolder in there. It will only let you create one level of subfolder for grouping purposes. It's not necessarily a problem, but if you're used to being able to create folders and subfolders and subfolders, it is something that you need to be aware of just for organizational purposes. So what you'll notice once you create a folder in here, I'm going to expand that out, is remember I told you that you can't have subfolders in here. You can't create subfolders in here, just to be clear. Every folder that you create in the SSIS catalog will have two virtual folders created, projects and environments. If you deploy a project to one of these folders in the SSIS catalog, it will show up under projects. If you create an environment, an execution environment, that will also show up here as well, and I'll walk you through what that looks like in just a second. But every one of these folders will have the same two virtual subfolders. There's a projects and environments in this one, and this one as well. Again, you can't rename those, you can't create your own folders, but they're created, those are present by default. And if we refresh here, we should see that there is one project out here. So this is what the hierarchy will look like whenever you deploy a project out to the SSIS DB database. So within your folder, there's a projects virtual folder, and then the project name will be present up here, and all of your packages that are present in that project will appear as child items under the packages node, appropriately enough. Here are all my packages that I had in the most recent deployment that I had deployed out there. To manage any of these, I can simply right-click, and I've got a couple of options here. I can go to configure, I'll talk about that in a second. Execute will let me actually execute that, and if I want to see the properties, go down to the properties window down here. Now, one thing to note is that you've got, I'm not sure why the UI does this. I think it's by design, but I'm not sure why they designed it this way. You've got a configure option and you've got a properties option, and both of those have different settings. So do be aware that if you're looking to change something or set up an environment, for example, on a package, you have to go into configure. To set other properties, you have to go down into the properties item. So if you don't see what you're looking for in configure, go to properties and vice versa. So just to walk you through what executing a package looks like, I'm going to right click on that first package that we have there. I'm going to go down to the second item, which is execute. And you can see I've got a handy execution window. So it's a UI-based window that will let me do all the items related to this execution. So you can see on the first window here, I do have a parameter attached to this project. So it's not marked as required. If this had been a required parameter, I'm going to see in the value over here, I'm going to see an asterisk over here showing that I've got some deficiency because I haven't supplied a required value to that parameter yet. This one is not required, so I don't have to supply a value for that. If you didn't have any parameters for either that project or that package, you simply wouldn't see anything here at all. Over on your connection managers, just like you could in previous versions, you can override any connection manager on a case-by-case basis. So you can see that, obviously I'm a baseball fan, so I've got some baseball data here. I've got AdventureWorks. I've got several different connections out to my databases, and all those connections, all the properties will be listed over here to the right. If I want to override any of those connections separate from the parameters that I set up, I can override those on this window. My recommendation is that if you plan to override connections in that way, go ahead and put a parameter on the connection string and make it a parameter. The reason for that is if you do that, now my parameters tab is the only place I have to go to reconfigure any value that's expected by that package. If I don't do that, if I use the connection manager override like I'm showing here, you've got to go to the parameters window and you've got to go to the connection managers window. You've got two different places that you're configuring it. Keep it simple, use the KISS principle, and anytime you've got anything that you expect to override, connection strings would certainly be one of those things. Go ahead and put those in as parameters and override them in parameters and not in the connection managers window. And then finally, over on the Advanced tab, this is where you can do property overrides. I won't go too far off the rails on property overrides. I will tell you this. I can count on one hand with fingers remaining the number of times I've even played with property overrides like this. This allows you to override pretty much any property in SSIS. This was also present in older versions of SSIS. My recommendation is don't use this. The syntax is quirky, and it's just like what I mentioned on connection managers. If there's something you expect to override, go ahead and update your package, put that in as a parameter, and then override it at the parameter level and not on the Advanced tab. You'll save yourself a whole lot of frustration on getting the syntax right and having multiple places to look at when you need to do a reconfiguration. A couple things that you will want to pay attention to, however, down here, this is the logging level. I mentioned that the logging level is a runtime setting that you specify for every execution. In this case, we're leaving it as basic. That's the default value for the SSIS catalog. If I don't change it, it'll simply log on basic. If I'm using anything Excel related, chances are good that I'm going to have to use the 32-bit runtime as opposed to the 64-bit runtime. So if that's the case, you want to check that. And then finally, I kind of wrote over that with that box. But if you're using an environment, we'll circle back on environments in just a second. You would specify what environment you're using in the drop-down box here. So that's the execution box. Now, if I go ahead and click OK, this will start the execution. I'm going to do that, but first I'm going to click Script button. Many of the tasks in SSIS in the UI will have that script button where you can script out those options, and I want to show you what the script looks like as well. So I'm going to hit that, let that create the script behind the scenes, but I am going to go ahead and click OK here and let it start the execution. You'll see that it pops up a window and says, it gives me the dialog that the execution has started and asks me if I want to go in and see the execution report for that. This is one of the beautiful parts of the SSIS catalog, is that it's got a built-in set of reports that run in Management Studio that will allow me to see what's running, what's failed, how long something has been running, and so on. So I can click OK or click Yes, and that will take me into the report. It'll pull that up as soon as that report's available. It'll probably show me this has already succeeded since I was talking through that. Even if the package hasn't yet completed, it will still show you this report. Had this still been running, it would have shown me, instead of succeeded, it would have shown me that it was still running, or it was queued, or some other status. There's 10 different statuses that might be applicable here. Generally, what you'll see is either running, completed or succeeded, or failed. But there's several others. If it's been created but not executed, if it was abnormally terminated, that's another status available. But typically those three, either running, succeeded, or failed, is what you'll see in here. This defines the operation ID or the execution ID. It tells me when it started, tells me when it stopped, how long it ran for, who executed it, and then task by task, this will tell me what succeeded and what failed. So in almost any package execution, if you've got a number of different tasks and containers, some could complete successfully and some could fail. That's important information to know what part succeeded, what part failed from a logging perspective. So this will show you very easily what pieces were successful and what failed. And then off to the right, any parameters that I passed in will be shown here as well. Now you remember that we had that connection string parameter that we did not supply a value to. That one is shown here. It's shown as blank because we didn't pass in a value for that, but it will be logged in the parameter logging table that we passed in a parameter. There's a handful of other values here that aren't represented, or rather that we didn't pass in but are represented in that table. Those are system level parameters that will always show up. So even if you don't pass in a parameter, there is a small set of system parameters that will always be present during that execution. This is a drillable report, so if I want to see more information about, for example, I've got a data flow. I want to see information about that data flow. I can click on that, and it will show me. We don't have any error messages on here, but had we had any error messages, those would have shown up first, followed by all the rest of the system messages. So the reporting system is pretty rich in here. You don't necessarily have to go and remember when we executed that, we clicked yes, that we wanted to see that report. That's not the only opportunity to see that report. If I right click on that same package, go down to reports, standard reports, and then all executions, that will take me not to that one execution, but it will show me all the executions that have taken place for that one package. So let's drill into that, reports, standard reports, all executions, and I'm now going to see a list of all the executions that have taken place. By default, that's filtered to the last week. I can change that filter if I want and say show me everything since pretty much since the beginning of time, at least on this machine. So from 9/1/2015, well, it looks like I've only got that one execution for this package. If I'd had other executions, those would have shown up here because I only had the one. Because I only had the one, that's the only one represented here. It'll show me all the successes or failures. It also shows me when they were executed on what date and then the duration. If I want a quick snapshot into how long this package typically runs, show me the last 10, show me the last month, or whatever the case may be. This is a great view for that. And it's even abstracted a little further by going here. If I right click on not the package itself, I'm going to right click on the catalog. Go to reports, standard reports, and all executions, just like we did a minute ago. Now I'm looking at all the executions not for that one package, but for all the packages in the SSIS catalog. Once again, I'll change my filter to start at 2015. And since I started this SSIS catalog, I've got 90 failed executions and 136 successful executions, at least for the records that I still have in the database. I'll get to that in just a second. But I can drill in, just like we saw a minute ago, I can drill into any of those executions by clicking on the overview for that one execution. I can go to all the messages. If I want to see task by task performance, I can also see that on execution performance as well. And again, all these reports are drillable. The caveat to these reports is that the person running the report has to have Management Studio on their machine. These reports only run from within Management Studio. Also, they have to have one of two security levels. They either have to be system administrator on a SQL Server, or they have to be in one of two security groups in integration services. I believe it's SSIS admin, and then there's a new, this is only in 2016, there's a new group in 2016. And I forget the name of the group, but it's basically a report monitor group that you can put them in so they can see these reports as well. So they're very rich, they're very handy, but the person running those reports does have to have Management Studio and has to run them through Management Studio, and they have to have the appropriate permissions in the SSIS catalog before they can do that. So last thing I'll show you on executions, let me close out a couple of those old windows. Last thing that I'll show you on execution is, remember when we hit that the button to create the query or to script it out. This is the result of that, and I'll show you how this breaks down just a little bit. This is a little bit under the covers of what happens behind the scenes whenever you do an execution. The execution takes place in actually two phases with some optional steps in between. The first thing that you'll do is create the execution, and that's just a stored procedure in the SSIS catalog to create the execution. When you do that, you specify the name of the package, the folder name, the project name, whether to use 32-bit runtime, and if you have an environment reference, you'd specify that as well. That doesn't kick off the execution. That only creates your execution record in the database, or I call it the intent to execute. It means at some point we're going to come back and execute that package later. Just for presentation purposes, that default script will select that execution ID. It will show it to you. Next up, we set any execution parameter values. This is completely optional. Unless you have any required parameters in your project or package, you don't need this piece at all. Because we scripted it out, it will automatically create in the script a system parameter defining logging level. Because we didn't change the logging level from the default, I could simply delete this completely, and the net effect would be the same. It's simply using the default logging level. If I wanted to get more information and specify verbose, for example, I could do that, but because I'm using the default, I don't have to specify anything at all. So after we create the execution, if we were to apply any parameters, now we're ready to actually execute the package. Kick off, start execution, and that will start immediately. Now, you remember what we saw earlier in the log? It showed that it had run for about 10 seconds before it completed. I'm going to go ahead and run what we have here. And you can see that didn't run for nearly 10 seconds. In fact, if I look on the bottom right, it didn't even register a full second. The reason for that is that start execution is by default an asynchronous operation, meaning that it's doing exactly what its name implies. It's starting the execution, but it's not waiting around to see did it complete, did it succeed or fail. It's simply kicking it off. And as long as you specified a valid package up in the create execution call and you have permission to execute that package, you won't get any errors there, even if the package were to fail. So do be aware of that. From a workflow perspective, I don't love that default behavior. I wish that at a minimum, start execution would wait until the package has completed its execution before it would return. And I wish you could force it to fail automatically, force that call to fail if the package were to have failed. But just because that's not the default behavior doesn't mean you can't override that. And I'll show you what I mean by that. I've created my own script over here. Let me get rid of the results window. Created my own script. By the way, if you're writing a T-SQL script to execute a package, don't write that by hand. Do what I just did. Go into the UI and create the execution, script it out, and then cancel the execution in the UI. That will still leave the script out there, and you can modify that script. That way you don't have to worry about memorizing all the syntax. So I took that script, I formatted it a little bit better where I can see everything on one screen, kicking off this package. It's in this folder and this project. The only difference here is, so I've still left my logging level the same, or rather I'm still making the call to the logging level. The difference here is I'm using a different logging level. The default logging level is 1, which is basic. In using 3, I'm overriding that and saying I want to use the verbose logging mode instead of the default basic logging mode. So I'm overriding that. I'm also adding an optional system parameter. And if I scroll off to the right, you can see that system parameter is named synchronized. Just like the name implies, that means that this execution will run synchronously. Meaning that it will, whenever I kick off, back to the left just a little bit, once I kick off start execution, that will run the start execution stored procedure as long as the package is running. So if the package runs for a minute or 10 minutes or 10 hours, start execution will continue to run until that package succeeds or fails. However, keep in mind from a workflow perspective that even if you use the synchronized parameter, it will still not report success or failure. It simply reports that the stored procedure to start the execution was kicked off successfully. And I'll show you what I mean by that. Let me go ahead and execute all of this code. So we're going to let that run. You can see it's running longer than it did a minute ago because we run it synchronously instead of asynchronously. Took about 4 seconds to run. It tells me that the command completed successfully, but if I look at the package back in the catalog, just based on the name, you can probably guess what the behavior is. Go into all executions for that one package. And you can see for that most recent execution that we just kicked off, that shows to have failed. So even though the stored procedure said it had completed successfully, yes, technically it did complete successfully because all it was doing was starting the execution, but not waiting for the execution to complete. So what I would have to do on that is, and these scripts will be available in the download, so you don't have to worry about jotting down what I'm about to show you here. So what I typically do from a workflow perspective is once I execute that, if I want that script to fail, if the package fails, separately from once the start execution has run, I then check my logging tables or my logging view, and you can see I'm using the catalog.executions view that I mentioned earlier that appeared in my slide deck a little bit earlier. Select the status from that view where the execution ID equals the execution ID that we referenced a little bit earlier. If that's not equal to 7, and 7 means success, then I want to fail by using the raise error, and I'm raising a severity of 16, which means the script will actually fail if that returns anything other than a status of 7. So I'm going to rerun that script. I'm going to go ahead and enable that piece. I didn't select this bottom piece earlier, so it ran without that earlier. So what I should see now is that something went wrong in that catalog execution, because we're not just relying on the success or failure of start execution, which did succeed. We're actually looking at the SSIS catalog table to see what was the status of that execution, and if it failed, I want to fail the whole package. So that's execution. My preference is to use T-SQL like we've shown here. You can do everything that I just showed you in the UI, but you've got a lot more control if you do it in T-SQL because you can automate this. You can't really automate operations in the UI. You can easily automate this because it is T-SQL. All right, take a quick look at versioning. So I'm going to right-click on Intro to the SSIS catalog. Whoops, I'm going to go into the project. That was the folder. I'm going to go into the project. Right-click on that project. The fourth item down is versions, and this will show me all the versions, and that's not a good one to show you because I only have one. Let me go back up into this one. I know we have multiple versions in this one. Bear with me just 1 second. There we go. So for this project, you can see that I've got multiple versions deployed out here. This will show me for every version that we have out there when it was originally deployed. If that has been restored at some point, it will show me that. If I had a description out here, and then the DLSN, or basically the deployment, the number of the deployment version that we have out there. By default, this is the view that you'll see. The most recent version that you deployed will be the one that's marked as the active version. However, if you have, let's say you have one of the oops moments that I described a little bit earlier. If you have one of those moments, you need to quickly go back to the older version of the code. You can do this. So click on that second version. I'm going to use the button on the bottom right to select that I want to restore to the selected version. It's going to prompt me, are you sure you want to do that? I'll click yes. It gives me a confirmation dialog. And now if I execute any package in this project, it's going to execute not the version that we deployed on June 16th, but the version that we deployed on June 5th. And that applies to any action that I take for that project. So if I export that project to a file, if I execute it, if I validate it, it's using this version as opposed to the newer version. Now, if I want to go back, that's just as easy. Let's go back to the most recent version. So I click on that one. Again, press the button to restore to the selected version. Are you sure? Yes, I am. And now we go back to the most recent version. So now any execution is on the newer version of code. Again, don't use this for source control. This is for regression testing. This is for your oops moment of deploying to the wrong environment. That's really the only two use cases for that. It's not for storing code history. So do keep that in mind. You can see 6 different versions out here. By default, the SSIS catalog will keep up to 10. So on your 11th, that 11th or the oldest one will roll off. When you deploy again, the oldest one will roll off, and so on. And then if I go into the catalog, right-click on the SSIS DB catalog itself, go into properties. A few of the options that you can configure are shown here. So these are all, I believe these are all the default options that are set out of the box. Yes, it is. So on your log, by default, it's going to keep a year's worth of logging information, which means that if you use the default settings on the SSIS catalog, it will every day, it will run an SSIS SQL Server agent job that will go in and clean up some of your old information out of your log. Do be careful in using that setting, and here's why. At least on older versions of integration services, I'm not certain that they fixed it on newer versions or not, but I can say that performance is better in newer versions. But at least on older versions, they would use, they actually had on their foreign keys on delete cascade turned on, which means that it would go down to the leaf level and start deleting things, and that delete would bubble up to the parent. That introduced some serious performance issues, especially if you had a really busy log table. So a couple of recommendations to keep in mind here. You might consider knocking this down to a lower version, or rather to a lower value. Maybe keep 90 days worth, keep 60 days worth. However, even that introduces some issues, because if you're purging off your log history, you're also losing all the history, all the how long did the package run a year ago? How much data were we processing through a year ago? So do keep that in mind, that if you purge that off in a more frequent basis, you're also losing some logging data. My preference is, and it takes more work to do this, but my preference is, if you're deleting logging information from the SSIS catalog, go ahead and do it on a more frequent basis, but have some mechanism to get that logging information into some cold storage. You can create an SSIS package, as a matter of fact. Connect to those key tables, catalog.executions, catalog.executable statistics, maybe a couple of others, and pull out the essential logging information, put that into another database, put it into a set of files where you can 2 or 3 or 4 years from now see how long your package was executing against 10 million rows, so you can see how it's now performing on 100 million rows. Or if you've got less data, for example, it'll show you performance information. It'll show you auditing information if you're logging to that level, if you're capturing row counts and things like that. So again, knocking this value down to something less than a full year is a double-edged sword. It means you have a smaller SSIS DB database, but it also means that you're losing some of your logging data. So tread carefully. My recommendation, it does take a little bit of extra work, is to ship that off and get that logging information into something that you can year over year over year keep reporting from. All right, so the last thing I'll show you is we'll go through briefly what the environments look like. So I'm going to expand the environments over here, and you can see that I've got env1 for environment. I've already created an environment on this SSIS catalog. What an environment looks like is, if I right-click, create the environment, we'll call this one intro SSIS. Click OK. Now I'm going to go back in and configure that environment. Now this looks a little bit like the execution dialog, except that if I go into the variables tab on the second item over there, this is where we set up our variables. These will translate, a variable in an environment will translate into a parameter on your SSIS package. So if you specify an environment at runtime, that means that you're supplying all those parameter values in the project, in the package, with variables from this environment. You don't have to use an environment, but once you set up a package or a project to use an environment, you either have to tell it what environment you're going to use or pass in substitute parameters when you execute that package. And the way that looks is, let me show you over on this project. Going to execute this one. So you can see that I've got on my parameters window, I've got my connection string like we saw previously. I've also got a parameter for encryption key and processing folder. And like I mentioned that you would see, you've got some exclamation points out here. This indicates that we've got some sort of deficiency. We've got some missing value here. The reason for that is I have set this package up to use an environment, and I haven't specified the environment that we're going to use. So I have to either go into this parameter, set a different value, or I have to specify the environment that we're using. Let's go the simpler route. I'm going to click environment. It's using env1. If I configured this to use more than one environment, those would all be down here. I've only set this up to use the one environment for right now, but all my values that are passed into those parameters are now coming from the SSIS environment variables and satisfied by that. So if I click on OK, that'll execute that. I'm not going to do that. However, I will go into the script, and I want to show you what this looks like on the script window. Let me get to the end of the line here. I don't love how it formats this thing by default. So this is what it will look like. This is the difference that you'll see on the script itself. It'll pass in a reference to reference ID of 4, which is the ID under the covers. It's the ID of that reference, the environment reference that we're using. So rather than passing in parameter by parameter by parameter, now we can use the environment to satisfy that. Using environments takes a little bit of getting used to, because previously you would have an XML file, you could have multiple SQL Server environment, or rather SQL Server configurations that you were using. Now you can specify either 0 or 1 environment. So what I mean by that is you can't specify, so in older versions you could say I want to use this XML file, these 2 SQL Server configuration tables, and a machine environment variable. You can't do that in environments in SSIS. You can still use an environment and some parameters separately, but if you're passing in an environment to an execution, you can only use one environment per execution. You don't have to use one at all, but you can't use multiple. You have to use either 0 or 1 environments. So that's a quick overview of the SSIS catalog. I think we're a shade over our 45 minutes on what we had planned. This is kind of an intro talk, and what I refer to on that is because we've got quite a few people out there who are not yet using the SSIS catalog, I intended this to be a kickoff for a longer series on the catalog. Most of what we talked about today, we talked about at the 5 or 10,000 foot level. We're going to have more posts or more webinars in this series that will go into more depth on how to do execution, how to create a workflow, how to fully use environments and parameters, how to manage this in the enterprise where you've got multiple SSIS servers and catalogs and things like that. So you'll get some follow-up messages from me. I'll also include the fact that we'll have more webinars on this. Be on the lookout on my blog as well as on Twitter and on my mailing list on those upcoming webinars. Would definitely love to hear your feedback on that. I'll thank you for your time. I certainly appreciate you spending your lunch hour, or if you're elsewhere, just spending an hour with me talking about the SSIS catalog. Look forward to seeing you on future webinars, and I hope you enjoy your day and your upcoming weekend.